In the pristine trauma bay of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, a former Army combat medic was about to face her most brutal enemy yet. What started as routine orientation took a shocking turn when she encountered systematic discrimination. Madison Taylor wasn't your typical nurse. For 6 years, she had saved soldiers under enemy fire in Afghanistan, known for unshakable composure under extreme pressure. When Nurse Director Patricia Whitmore publicly mocked her burn scars, Madison had no idea this humiliation would trigger a hospital-wide reckoning. Her quiet dignity would expose years of institutional discrimination. What began as workplace harassment became complete transformation. St. Catherine's would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Madison Taylor sat in her car outside St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, her hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The impressive glass and steel structure rose before her like a gleaming fortress, its windows reflecting the early morning sun in brilliant flashes that made her squint. She'd been sitting here for 15 minutes, watching the steady stream of healthcare workers flowing through the main entrance. Doctors in crisp white coats, nurses in colorful scrubs, administrators in business attire, all of them moving with purpose, belonging to something larger than themselves. Her left hand moved unconsciously to her neck, fingers tracing the raised edges of scarred tissue that no amount of concealer could fully hide. 3 years of healing, countless surgeries, and endless physical therapy had brought her to this moment. The burns that stretched from her left ear down to her collarbone and continued along her arm were permanent reminders of that day in Kandahar, when the IED had torn through their convoy, when she'd pulled Rodriguez, Martinez, and Jackson from the burning vehicle while her own uniform melted against her skin. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, the same words she'd repeated every morning for the past 6 months while job hunting. 23 interviews, 23 rejections, some polite, others awkwardly direct about her unconventional appearance. Until Dr. Williams had called with news about St. Catherine's Veteran Care Program and their commitment to hiring former military medical personnel. Madison forced herself to release the steering wheel and check her appearance in the rearview mirror one final time. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing the scars she'd spent so many months trying to hide. Today, she'd made a conscious decision to wear her hair up. If she was going to work here, they needed to see exactly who they were hiring. The hospital's lobby impressed her immediately. Soaring ceilings, natural light streaming through strategically placed skylights, and a prominent display dedicated to veteran services. Photos of wounded warriors receiving care lined one wall, their faces radiating hope and determination. Madison felt something ease in her chest as she approached the reception desk. "Madison Taylor reporting for orientation," she told the elderly volunteer, whose name tag read Betty, 12 years of service. Betty's eyes flickered briefly to Madison's scars before returning to her computer screen, professional, neutral. Madison had learned to read these micro-expressions with surgical precision. "Welcome to St. Catherine's, dear. Take the elevator. To the 3rd floor. Human Resources is waiting for you." The orientation room buzzed with nervous energy as 6 new employees settled into chairs around a polished conference table. Madison chose a seat near the back, angling herself so her scars were less visible to the others. A young man with kind eyes and laugh lines introduced himself as David, a recent physical therapy graduate. Next to him sat Claire, a radiology technician fresh from her residency. The others followed suit, each carrying that peculiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that comes with new beginnings. Patricia Whitmore entered the room like she owned it, which, Madison quickly learned, she essentially did. The nurse director, was an elegant woman in her early 50s, with silver hair styled in a perfect bob and a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Madison's monthly rent. Her eyes swept the room with calculating precision, cataloguing each new face. "Welcome to St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital," Patricia began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Oh, you are now representatives of one of the most prestigious medical institutions on the West Coast. Our reputation has been built over decades through unwavering commitment to excellence, and that excellence extends to every aspect of our operation, including the professional image each of you projects." Madison felt those calculating eyes pause on her, lingering just long enough to make the point clear. Patricia's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her perfectly applied makeup. "We maintain the highest standards here," Patricia continued, her gaze moving on. "Our patients come to us during their most vulnerable moments, and they deserve to see confidence, competence, and professionalism reflected in every interaction." The tour that followed showcased St. Catherine's impressive facilities: state-of-the-art trauma bays, advanced imaging equipment, and a rehabilitation center that made Madison think of Jake Morrison, the Navy corpsman Captain Williams had mentioned. The Veteran Care Wing particularly caught her attention, a dedicated space designed specifically for military personnel and their families, complete with specialized PTSD counseling services and adaptive equipment. "This program is especially close to our hearts," Patricia explained to the group, though Madison noticed her tone had shifted to something more rehearsed. "We understand the unique challenges our service members face in transitioning to civilian healthcare." Madison wanted to believe the sincerity in those words, but something in Patricia's delivery felt hollow, like she was reciting lines from a brochure rather than speaking from genuine conviction. The trauma unit introduction proved more encouraging. The nursing staff seemed genuinely welcoming, though Madison caught the familiar pattern of reactions to her appearance. Some offered warm smiles that reached their eyes, others maintained professional politeness while their gazes lingered uncomfortably on her scars. A few simply looked away entirely. "Don't mind the staring," whispered Sarah Kim, a veteran trauma nurse with kind eyes and calloused hands. "They're good people mostly, just need time to see past the surface." Madison was processing this advice when the emergency alarm blared through the unit. "Incoming trauma, ETA 3 minutes, MVA with possible head injury and internal bleeding." The transformation was immediate. The relaxed orientation atmosphere vanished as the trauma team snapped into action. Madison found herself swept along as equipment was positioned, medications prepared, and roles assigned with military-like precision. "New girl, you're observing only," barked Dr. Stevens, the attending physician. But as the patient arrived, a young woman barely conscious with obvious signs of internal hemorrhaging, Madison's training overrode her instructions. She watched the team work, noting their efficiency, but also spotting critical details others missed. The patient's breathing pattern suggested possible pneumothorax. Her skin color indicated more severe blood loss than initially assessed. When the patient's blood pressure began dropping rapidly, Madison stepped forward. "Excuse me, doctor," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd learned in combat zones. "I believe we're looking at a tension pneumothorax. Her trachea's deviating, and the breath sounds are diminished on the left side." Dr. Stevens glanced at her sharply, then at the patient. His expression shifted as he registered what Madison had observed. "Get me a needle decompression kit, now." The next few minutes blurred together in familiar choreography. Madison found herself assisting without being asked, her hands moving with practiced precision as they worked to stabilize the patient. The combat medic training that had saved lives in Afghanistan now guided her movements in this sterile civilian environment. As the patient's vitals stabilized and she was wheeled towards surgery, Dr. Stevens turned to Madison with undisguised respect. "That was exceptional diagnostic work. Where did you train?" "Kandahar. 3 tours as a combat medic." Understanding flickered in his eyes. "The scars?" "IED. Same day I saved 3 soldiers who might have died if I hadn't been paying attention to details." Dr. Stevens nodded slowly. "Well, we're lucky to have those eyes and instincts here now." From across the trauma bay, Madison noticed Dr. Marcus Rodriguez watching their interaction with interest. The chief of trauma surgery had apparently witnessed the entire emergency response. Their eyes met briefly, and she caught something in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or approval. But it was Patricia Whitmore's reaction that made Madison's stomach tighten. The nurse director stood near the nurse's station, her face a mask of barely controlled displeasure as she observed the praise being directed toward the newest staff member. The woman who had just proven that appearances could be profoundly deceiving. As the trauma bay returned to its normal rhythm, Madison felt the familiar weight of being watched and judged. But for the first time in months, she also felt something else. The satisfaction of knowing she belonged here, regardless of what others might think of her scars. Dr. Rodriguez approached as she finished cleaning up the equipment she'd used. "Ms. Taylor, I presume? I'm Marcus Rodriguez. I'd like to speak with you when you have a moment." The recognition in his voice suggested this conversation might be exactly what she needed. But the cold stare from Patricia Whitmore across the room warned that her first day at St. Catherine's was far from over. Dr. Rodriguez approached as she finished cleaning up the equipment she'd used. "Ms. Taylor, I presume? I'm Marcus Rodriguez. I'd like to speak with you when you have a moment." The recognition in his voice suggested this conversation might be exactly what she needed. But the cold stare from Patricia Whitmore across the room warned that her first day at St. Catherine's was far from over. Madison followed Dr. Rodriguez to his office, noting how other staff members stepped aside with respectful nods as he passed. His office surprised her. Instead of the sterile, trophy-laden space she'd expected from a chief of surgery, the room felt lived in and genuine. Medical journals were stacked alongside well-worn paperbacks. A faded photograph of soldiers in desert camouflage occupied a prominent spot on his desk, and she recognized the 1,000-yard stare in their eyes. "Please sit," Marcus said, settling behind his desk with the careful movements of someone who'd spent too many hours on his feet. "That was impressive work in there. Dr. Stevens tells me you spotted the pneumothorax before anyone else." Madison shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I just noticed the signs. Combat training makes you pay attention to details that might save lives." "Combat training." Marcus picked up the photograph from his desk, studying it for a moment. "Afghanistan. 3 tours, forward operating bases, convoy escorts, emergency field medicine." She paused, then added quietly, "You. No military service, but I lost my best friend in a training accident at Fort Bragg. Miguel was going to be a combat medic, like you." Marcus set the photo down carefully. "His death is part of why I chose trauma surgery over the lucrative specialties my mother preferred. There's something about emergency medicine that connects you to what really matters." Madison felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Most people see the scars and either stare or look away. They don't see the training behind them. "The scars tell a story," Marcus said simply, "but today your actions told a different one. Dr. Stevens has 20 years of emergency experience, and you caught something he missed. That doesn't happen by accident." Through the office window, Madison could see Patricia Whitmore in animated conversation with two other administrators. Even from this distance, the woman's agitation was evident in her sharp gestures and rigid posture. Marcus followed her gaze. Patricia's having one of her meetings. She likes to stay informed about developments in the hospital. She doesn't seem particularly pleased about my performance today. Patricia values certain things above others, Marcus said carefully. Image, appearance, traditional hierarchies. She's built her career on maintaining what she considers proper standards. He leaned forward slightly. But excellence in patient care trumps everything else here. My mother founded this hospital on that principle, and it's not negotiable. Madison's eyebrows rose. Your mother? Elena Rodriguez, hospital CEO and the driving force behind our veteran care program. Marcus smiled with obvious pride. She built St. Catherine's from a small clinic into what you see today. After my father's military service ended, she became passionate about supporting veterans' transition to civilian life. Then she'd understand why I'm here. She would. But she's also trusting me to identify and nurture talent in the trauma unit, which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you. Marcus pulled out a thick folder. Captain Williams sent your military medical records along with his recommendation. 3 bronze stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and commendations for saving 17 lives under enemy fire. Madison stiffened. I don't need special treatment because of my service record. I'm not offering special treatment. I'm offering opportunity. Marcus opened the folder, revealing pages of documentation. We're expanding our veteran trauma program. We need nurses who understand combat medicine, PTSD, and the unique challenges military patients face. Your technical skills are exceptional, but your lived experience is irreplaceable. A knock at the door interrupted them. Patricia Whitmore entered without waiting for permission, her smile bright and artificial. Dr. Rodriguez, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Ms. Whitmore, Ms. Taylor and I were discussing her integration into the trauma unit. Patricia's gaze settled on Madison with calculating coldness. Yes, I heard about the incident in Trauma Bay 3. I trust you're emphasizing the importance of following proper protocols and chain of command. Ms. Taylor's quick thinking likely saved a patient's life, Marcus replied evenly. Her military training proved invaluable. Of course. Patricia's smile never wavered. Though I hope she understands that civilian healthcare operates differently than battlefield medicine. We have standards to maintain, protocols to follow. Our patients expect a certain level of professionalism. Madison felt the familiar burn of prejudice disguised as concern. I understand protocols, Ms. Whitmore. I also understand that saving lives sometimes requires decisive action. Naturally, though I trust Dr. Rodriguez has explained that at St. Catherine's we value teamwork and proper channels above individual heroics. Patricia's tone remained pleasant, but ice crystallized beneath each word. Our reputation depends on every team member understanding their role and limitations. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Ms. Taylor demonstrated exceptional clinical judgment and medical expertise. Those are precisely the qualities we need more of. Certainly, Patricia agreed, though her expression suggested otherwise. I simply want to ensure our newest staff member understands our culture and expectations. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up orientation session to review proper procedures and professional presentation standards. The threat in those words was clear. Madison straightened in her chair, military posture reasserting itself. I'm here to provide excellent patient care, Ms. Whitmore. My appearance doesn't change my competence. Of course not, Patricia replied smoothly. Though I'm sure you understand that patient comfort and family confidence are essential considerations. Sometimes perception matters as much as reality. The silence that followed crackled with tension. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice carrying quiet authority. Ms. Taylor will be working closely with me to develop protocols for our expanded veteran trauma program. I'll personally oversee her integration into the unit. Patricia's smile became even more brittle. How wonderful. I'm sure our patients will appreciate your mentorship. She turned to Madison. I look forward to seeing how you adapt to our environment, Ms. Taylor. St. Catherine's has very specific standards, and I'm confident you'll learn to meet them. After Patricia left, Marcus shook his head slowly. I apologize for that. Patricia can be challenging. She sees my scars and assumes I'm damaged goods, Madison said quietly. I've dealt with worse. I imagine you have. But you shouldn't have to deal with it here. Marcus closed her file and leaned back in his chair. I want you to know that you have an advocate in this hospital. Your skills, your experience, your perspective, they're exactly what we need. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope mixed with determination. What happens next? Next, you prove them all wrong. Not through grand gestures, but through consistent excellence. Every patient you help, every life you save, every colleague you teach, it all builds credibility that no one can take away. Marcus stood and extended his hand. Welcome to the team, Madison. The real team. As they shook hands, Madison caught sight of Patricia through the window, now in conversation with other staff members. The woman's animated gestures and the direction of their glances left little doubt about the topic of discussion. The battle lines were being drawn, and Madison realized her first day at St. Catherine's had been just the opening skirmish. But for the first time since her discharge from the army, she felt ready for the fight ahead. As they shook hands, Madison caught sight of Patricia through the window, now in conversation with other staff members. The woman's animated gestures and the direction of their glances left little doubt about the topic of discussion. The battle lines were being drawn, and Madison realized her first day at St. Catherine's had been just the opening skirmish. But for the first time since her discharge from the army, she felt ready for the fight ahead. 3 days later, Madison had settled into a rhythm at St. Catherine's that felt surprisingly natural. Her shifts in the trauma unit had been steady, her colleagues cautiously welcoming, and her confidence slowly rebuilding with each successful patient interaction. Dr. Rodriguez had been true to his word, involving her in protocol discussions and veteran-patient consultations that utilized her unique experience. That Thursday afternoon shift started like any other. Madison arrived early, checked equipment, and reviewed patient charts with the methodical precision that had kept soldiers alive in Afghanistan. The trauma bay hummed with its usual controlled energy, monitors beeping, staff moving with practiced efficiency, the constant undercurrent of readiness that defined emergency medicine. She was restocking supplies when Patricia Whitmore's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Ms. Taylor, could you join me at the nurses' station, please? The words themselves were benign, but something in Patricia's tone made Madison's military instincts sharpen. Around the trauma bay, conversations quieted as staff members sensed the shift in atmosphere. Patricia stood behind the central desk, like a general commanding from high ground, her posture rigid with barely contained authority. Madison approached with careful neutrality, aware that several nurses, 2 orderlies, and Dr. Stevens were within earshot. Near the family waiting area, she noticed an elderly man in a veteran's cap visiting his wife, their quiet conversation now overshadowed by the tension radiating from the nurses' station. Ms. Taylor, Patricia began, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure an audience, I've been reviewing your first few days with us, and I have some concerns about your adjustment to our professional standards. Madison felt the Familiar sensation of being evaluated, judged, found wanting. But this time something was different. This time she wasn't alone in a job interview or facing rejection from strangers. This was her workplace, her colleagues, her patients. "What concerns specifically?" Madison asked, keeping her voice level. Patricia's smile was sharp as surgical steel. "Well, let's start with your appearance. While I understand your situation, I think we need to discuss more appropriate ways to present yourself professionally. Our patients and their families expect a certain standard." The words hit like a physical blow, but Madison had endured worse. Around them, the trauma bay had gone unnaturally quiet. She could feel eyes. On her, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable, a few openly curious about how this confrontation would unfold. "My appearance meets all hospital dress code requirements," Madison replied carefully. "Technically, yes," Patricia agreed, her tone suggesting this was insufficient. "But you must understand that in a place like St. Catherine's, we cater to a particular clientele. Families who are already dealing with trauma don't need additional distractions. Perhaps we could explore options for better concealing your scars. There are excellent cosmetic products available, or you might consider different uniform choices that offer more coverage." The suggestions hung in the air like poison gas. Madison felt her throat tighten, not from shame, but from rage, carefully controlled by years of military discipline. She was vaguely aware of Dr. Stevens pausing his chart review, of Sarah Kim's sharp intake of breath, of the veteran in the waiting area turning to stare. "These scars," Madison said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd learned in combat. "Zones were earned pulling 3 soldiers from a burning vehicle after an IED attack. They represent service, sacrifice, and the fact that I chose others' lives over my own comfort." Patricia's smile became predatory. "Of course, and we're all grateful for your service. But this is a hospital, not a military base. Our patients don't need reminders of violence and trauma when they're already struggling with their own medical crises." The implication was clear. Madison's scars represented something ugly, something to be hidden, something that made others uncomfortable, through no fault of their own. Around them, staff members shifted uneasily. Some looked away, unwilling to witness the public humiliation. Others watched with varying degrees of horror and fascination. Furthermore, Patricia continued, encouraged by Madison's silence, "I've noticed some concerning patterns in your interactions with protocols. Military training is valuable, but civilian healthcare requires different approaches. We can't have staff members making independent decisions or circumventing established chains of command." Madison's hands clenched at her sides. "Are you referring to the pneumothorax diagnosis that saved a patient's life?" "I'm referring to a concerning pattern of insubordination disguised as initiative," Patricia replied smoothly. Dr. Stevens was perfectly capable of handling that situation without unsolicited input from nursing staff. Your role is to follow orders, not to diagnose patients. From across the trauma bay, Madison caught Dr. Stevens's expression of disbelief. The man who had praised her diagnostic skills 3 days earlier now watched this character assassination with obvious discomfort. The elderly veteran in the waiting area had abandoned any pretense of privacy. He stood slowly, his purple heart pin catching the fluorescent lights as he moved closer to the nurse's station. His weathered face carried the kind of anger that came from watching his brothers and sisters under attack. "Ma'am," he said to Patricia, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak, "I couldn't help but overhear. That young woman's scars tell me everything I need to know about her character, and your words tell me everything I need to know about yours." Patricia's face flushed. "Sir, this is a private hospital matter. This is a public humiliation of a war hero," the veteran shot back. I've seen enough wounded warriors come home to recognize courage when I see it, and I've seen enough bureaucrats to recognize cowardice too. The trauma bay had gone completely silent now. Even the usual sounds of monitors and equipment seemed muted as everyone processed what they were witnessing. Madison stood frozen, caught between gratitude for the veterans' defense and mortification at being the center of such a scene. Patricia's mask of professional courtesy finally slipped. I will not be lectured about hospital policy by uninformed. Civilians, security can escort you out if necessary. Try it, the veteran replied quietly. I'd love to see how that plays in the newspapers. Prestigious hospital kicks out veteran for defending war hero. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, Patricia regained her composure, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her posture. Ms. Taylor, she said, her voice ice-cold, we'll continue this discussion in my office, privately. Madison looked around the trauma bay at the faces of her colleagues. Some offered sympathetic nods, others studied their feet. A few seemed genuinely shocked by what they'd witnessed, but all of them now knew exactly where they stood in Patricia Whitmore's hierarchy of worthiness. Yes, ma'am, Madison replied, using the tone she'd once reserved for officers she didn't respect but couldn't disobey. As she followed Patricia toward the administrative offices, Madison heard the veteran's voice behind her. You hold your head high, soldier. Real Americans know what those scars represent. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they highlighted how alone she really was in this gleaming hospital where her service meant nothing and her scars meant everything, for all the wrong reasons. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they highlighted how alone she really was in this gleaming hospital where her service meant nothing and her scars meant everything, for all the wrong reasons. Madison made it through Patricia's office. Discussion. 15 minutes. Of thinly veiled threats disguised as professional development advice, with military stoicism intact. But as she walked back toward the trauma unit, she felt the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation that stopped when she passed, every careful smile that didn't quite reach concerned eyes. She was restocking supplies in the equipment room, grateful for a task that let her avoid eye contact when someone cleared their throat behind her. That was some grade A bullshit back there. Madison turned to find a man leaning against the doorframe, his right leg ending in a high-tech prosthetic that he made no effort to hide. His scrubs bore the physical therapy department logo, and his face carried the particular brand of irreverent humor she recognized from fellow veterans. Jake Morrison, he said, extending his hand. Navy corpsman, 2 tours in Iraq. Now I help people learn to walk again, which beats the hell out of teaching them to crawl under enemy fire. Madison shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Madison Taylor, Army combat medic. I know who you are. Word travels fast in this place, especially when it involves Whitmore making an ass of herself in public. Jake's grin was infectious. Also heard you spotted a pneumothorax that Dr. Stevens missed. Nice work. Just doing my job. Bullshit. Again. I've worked with Stevens for 3 years. The man's good, but he's never served in a place where missing details gets people killed. Jake shifted his weight, the prosthetic moving with fluid precision. You've got that look, the one that comes from patching people up while mortars are dropping. Am I right? Madison felt something ease in her chest. Forward operating bases mostly, emergency medicine under fire. Exactly. So when some bureaucrat who's never seen anything worse than a paper cut tries to lecture you about medical protocols, it's pretty rich. Jake glanced down the hallway, then stepped further into the equipment room. Look, I don't know you well, but I know Whitmore. She's been gunning for anyone who doesn't fit her country club aesthetic since day one. How long have you been dealing with her? 2 years of active harassment, 3 years total. Jake's humor faded slightly. Started the day I showed up with this. He tapped his prosthetic. Apparently, visible reminders of military service make the donors uncomfortable. Bad for the hospital's image. Madison felt a familiar burn of anger. She actually said that? Not in those words. Whitmore's too smart for that. But she's got a dozen ways to make your life miserable while maintaining plausible deniability. Schedule manipulation, resource restrictions, endless performance reviews that question your fitness for duty. Sounds like you've survived it. Survived hell. I've thrived in spite of her. Jake's grin returned. The secret is building the right alliances. Whitmore may control the bureaucracy, but she doesn't control the people who actually do the work. Want to meet some of them? 20 minutes later, Madison found herself in the hospital cafeteria's far corner, surrounded by faces that carried their own stories of struggle and perseverance. Jake had assembled what he called the Underground Railroad, staff members who'd faced Whitmore's discrimination and learned to support each other. "This is Maria Santos," Jake said, indicating a petite woman with intelligent eyes and calloused hands. ICU nurse, single mom, worked her way through nursing school while raising 2 kids. Maria's smile was warm but cautious. "Patricia questioned my language skills during my first month. Apparently, my accent made patients uncomfortable. Her English was perfect, with only the slightest trace of her native accent. She suggested I consider positions in the kitchen or housekeeping instead." "Jesus," Madison muttered. "It gets better," said a tall black man Jake introduced as Kevin Williams, a respiratory therapist. "Whitmore asked me 3 times if I was sure I was qualified for my position. Wanted to see my credentials repeatedly. Funny how she never asks the white staff to prove they belong here." "The woman's got issues," added Sandra Chen, an occupational therapist with graying hair and tired eyes. "But she's careful about it. Never anything overt enough to file a formal complaint. Always has an excuse, always has witnesses who'll back up her version of events." Indeed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Madison listened to story after story, microaggressions, professional sabotage, character assassination, disguised as constructive feedback. Each account felt familiar, echoing her own experiences, not just at St. Catherine's, but at every job interview, every social interaction where her scars had marked her as different, damaged, lesser. "The thing is," Maria said quietly, "we all need these jobs. I've got kids to feed. Kevin's got student loans. Sandra's 3 years from retirement. None of us can afford to make waves." "So we survive," Jake added. "We do good work, we watch each other's backs, and we document everything. Because eventually Whitmore's going to go too far, and when she does, we'll be ready." "What about Dr. Rodriguez?" Madison asked. "He seems supportive." "Marcus is good people," Jake confirmed, "but he's also the CEO's son, which makes him careful about how he challenges Whitmore directly. Hospital politics are complicated when your mother signs the paychecks." Plus," Maria added, "Whitmore's smart enough to behave differently around him. She knows which battles to pick." Madison absorbed this information, feeling the familiar weight of being caught between hope and cynicism. These people had found a way to survive in a hostile environment, but survival wasn't the same as thriving. It certainly wasn't the same as changing the system that enabled the hostility in the first place. "There's something else," Sandra said, glancing around the table. "We think Whitmore's building a case against the veteran hiring program. She's been questioning the wisdom of prioritizing military experience over traditional qualifications." "Meaning?" "Meaning she wants to eliminate veteran preference hiring," Jake explained. "Make it easier to reject candidates based on cultural fit or professional presentation. Basically, give her the tools to legally discriminate against anyone who doesn't meet her standards." Madison felt ice settle in her stomach. When? Soon. She's been collecting evidence about integration challenges and patient feedback. Building a narrative that veteran hires require too much accommodation, create too many problems. Problems like me, you mean? Exactly like you, Maria said gently. Your success threatens her narrative, which is why she's escalating the harassment. She needs you to fail publicly to justify her position. The group fell silent, the weight of institutional discrimination settling over them like a familiar, unwelcome blanket. Madison looked around the table at these people who'd welcomed her, supported her, shared their own painful stories. They were good people, trapped in a bad situation, trying to do meaningful work while dodging professional landmines. But they were also survivors. Each had found ways to maintain their dignity and effectiveness, despite systematic attempts to undermine them. They'd built community in the face of isolation, created support networks that transcended official hierarchies. For the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's, Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the strength that comes from not being alone. "So, what do we do?" she asked. Jake's grin returned, sharper this time. "We do our jobs. We excel at our jobs, and we make sure everyone knows exactly how good we are at our jobs. Because the one thing Whitmore can't argue with is excellence. And if that's not enough, then we document everything and wait for her to hang herself," Maria said quietly. "Because bullies always overreach eventually. They can't help themselves." Madison nodded, feeling strategy crystallize in her mind. She'd faced worse enemies than Patricia Whitmore, in places where the stakes were life and death. This was just another kind of battlefield, requiring different tactics, but the same fundamental principles. Know your allies, understand your enemy, and never stop fighting for what's right. The war for her place at St. Catherine's was just beginning. The war for her place at St. Catherine's was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Madison had settled into an uneasy routine of excellence under scrutiny. Every patient interaction was flawless, every protocol followed. To the letter, every chart documented with military precision. Patricia's attempts at harassment continued, schedule changes, equipment shortages, and pointed comments about professional standards, but Madison endured them with the stoicism of someone who'd survived mortar attacks and roadside bombs. That Friday evening started quietly. Madison was reviewing patient charts when the emergency radio crackled to life with the kind of call that made experienced trauma teams tense. "St. Catherine's Trauma, this is Medic 7. We're incoming with multiple casualties from a highway pileup, 5 vehicles involved, at least 6 patients, 2 critical, 3 serious, 1 walking wounded. ETA 8 minutes. The trauma bay exploded into controlled chaos. Dr. Stevens barked orders while nurses prepped equipment and cleared space. Additional staff flooded in from other departments as the hospital's mass casualty protocol kicked into gear. Madison found herself assigned to Trauma Bay 2, working alongside Dr. Rodriguez, who'd been called in to handle the most critical cases. "Taylor, you're with me," Marcus said, pulling on gloves with practiced efficiency. "We're taking the worst one." The first ambulance screeched into the bay with sirens wailing. The paramedics' report was grim. 28-year-old male, motorcyclist versus semi-truck. Multiple trauma including suspected internal bleeding, possible spinal injury, and significant head trauma. BP dropping, pulse thready. Madison's training took over as they transferred the patient to their table. The young man was unconscious, his body broken in ways that reminded her of convoy attacks and IED casualties. But this was different. No dust, no gunfire, no threat of secondary explosions. Just the clinical precision of civilian trauma medicine. "What do you see?" Marcus asked as they began their assessment. Madison's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, examining injuries, processing the complex puzzle of trauma. "Medicine, Distended abdomen suggests internal bleeding. Pupils are unequal, possible intracranial pressure, and... She paused, her fingers detecting something wrong with the patient's breathing pattern. And... flail chest. Look at the paradoxical movement on the right side. Multiple rib fractures compromising respiratory function. Marcus nodded approvingly. Treatment priorities. Airway, breathing, circulation, Madison replied automatically. But we need to address the flail chest and get him to surgery for the internal bleeding. The head injury complicates everything. They worked in perfect synchronization. Madison's combat experience translating seamlessly to civilian trauma. Care. She anticipated Marcus's needs, prepared equipment before he asked, and provided the kind of steady support that only came from treating casualties under the worst possible conditions. That's when Patricia Whitmore appeared. "Dr. Rodriguez," she called out over the controlled chaos. "I need to speak with you about staffing assignments." Marcus didn't look up from the patient. "Not now, Patricia. We're in the middle of a critical case. This can't wait. There are concerns about proper supervision and protocol compliance." Madison felt ice form in her stomach as she realized. Patricia's target. The woman had chosen the worst possible moment to assert her authority during a life-threatening emergency when lives hung in the balance. "Dr. Rodriguez," Patricia continued, moving closer to their trauma bay, "I need assurance that all staff are operating within their designated roles and limitations." This time Marcus did look up, his expression dangerous. "Patricia, unless you're here to help save this man's life, get out of my trauma bay." "I'm here to ensure proper procedures are followed. Some staff members have shown concerning tendencies to exceed their authority." Madison's hands never stopped working, but she felt the familiar burn of being singled out, questioned, undermined. Around them, other staff members glanced over with expressions ranging from sympathy to embarrassment. Even in the middle of a medical emergency, Patricia was determined to make her point. "Patient's pressure is dropping," Madison reported, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to get him to OR now." "Agreed," Marcus said. "Prep for transport." As they prepared to move the patient, Patricia stepped directly into their path. "Dr. Rodriguez, I insist we discuss proper chain of command before—" "Move!" Marcus ordered, his voice carrying surgical steel. "Now!" For a moment, Patricia stood her ground, apparently willing to risk a patient's life to make her point about authority and hierarchy. The trauma bay fell silent, except for the patient's labored breathing and the steady beep of monitors. Finally, she stepped aside, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. They rushed the patient to surgery, where Madison found herself scrubbing in alongside Marcus, despite Patricia's obvious displeasure. The operation was complex, repairing internal bleeding while monitoring intracranial pressure and stabilizing multiple fractures. Madison's role should have been limited to basic assistance, but her combat experience made her invaluable. "Pressure's spiking," she observed, watching the monitors with the attention to detail that had kept soldiers alive in Afghanistan. "I see it. Options? Mannitol to reduce brain swelling, but we need to balance that against his blood loss. His body's already stressed from the internal bleeding." Marcus nodded, making the call that saved the patient's life. They worked for 3 hours, Madison anticipating every need, providing insights that came from treating similar injuries under enemy fire. When they finally closed, the patient's vitals were stable and his prognosis hopeful. In the surgical suite's aftermath, as they cleaned up and debriefed, Marcus turned to Madison with undisguised respect. "That was exceptional work. Your experience showed in every decision, every observation. This man is alive because of your expertise." "We're a team," Madison replied, but she felt the warmth of recognition spreading through her chest. "Dr. Rodriguez," Patricia's voice cut through the moment like a scalpel. She stood in the doorway, flanked by two other administrators, her expression coldly professional. "I need to discuss the protocols that were bypassed during tonight's emergency." "The only thing that matters," Marcus replied evenly, "is that we saved 6 lives tonight. Ms. Taylor's contribution was invaluable. Ms. Taylor exceeded her authorized scope of practice. There will need to be a formal review." Around them, other surgical staff had stopped their cleanup to listen. The confrontation was becoming public again. Patricia's need to assert dominance overriding professional discretion. "Review this," Marcus said, his voice carrying quiet authority. Ms. Taylor's military experience and diagnostic skills helped save a young man's life tonight. Her contribution was not just valuable, it was irreplaceable. Any review of her performance should focus on how we can better utilize her expertise, not punish her for excellence. The surgical suite fell silent. Madison felt the weight of every gaze, the tension between institutional authority and medical excellence playing out in real time. But for the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's, she also felt something else, the absolute certainty that she belonged here, regardless of what Patricia Whitmore believed. The battle lines were drawn, and tonight had proven which side deserved to win. The battle lines were drawn, and tonight had proven which side deserved to win. The following Monday morning brought an unexpected summons to the executive floor. Madison stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb past the familiar territory of patient floors into the rarefied administrative heights where decisions about the hospital's future were made. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman in crisp scrubs, her scars visible, but her posture radiating the confidence that came from knowing she'd saved lives. Elena Rodriguez's office commanded a panoramic view of the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the bustling medical campus below. The CEO herself was smaller than Madison had expected, but her presence filled the room with quiet authority. Photos lined her desk, military ceremonies, hospital groundbreakings, and what appeared to be a young Marcus in various stages of his medical training. "Ms. Taylor, please sit," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone genuinely pleased to meet her. "I apologize for the formal summons, but I wanted to speak with you personally about Friday night's emergency." Madison settled into the chair across from Elena's desk, noting the Purple Heart flag displayed prominently behind the CEO's chair alongside St. Catherine's colors. "Dr. Rodriguez tells me your performance was exceptional," Elena continued. 6 patients, all stable, all expected to make full recoveries. The trauma team worked flawlessly under extreme pressure. "It was a team effort, ma'am. Everyone contributed." Elena smiled. "Marcus said you'd be modest. He also said you spotted critical injuries that others missed, provided insights that saved lives, and demonstrated the kind of expertise that can't be taught in traditional nursing programs." Madison felt heat rise in her cheeks. After weeks of criticism and scrutiny, genuine praise felt almost foreign. "Your military service is exactly why we created the veteran hiring program," Elena said, leaning forward with obvious enthusiasm. "Combat medics understand trauma medicine in ways that civilian training simply can't replicate. You've seen the worst of human injury and learned to make life-or-death decisions under impossible conditions. That experience is part of who I am," Madison agreed carefully. "The scars are just the visible part." Elena's expression softened. "My late husband served 2 tours in Vietnam. He carried scars too, some visible, some not. He used to say that scars were proof of surviving. What should have destroyed you She paused, studying Madison with obvious interest. "I'd like to discuss expanding your role here. We're developing new protocols for veteran trauma care, and I can't think of anyone better qualified to help design them." Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of a future that used her skills rather than despite her appearance. What would that involve? Working directly with Marcus to develop training programs for civilian staff treating veteran patients, consulting on PTSD-informed care protocols, eventually perhaps leading a specialized trauma team focused on military-related injuries. Elena's enthusiasm was infectious. "We're also considering a partnership with the VA hospital to provide specialized emergency services for complex military cases." The opportunity was everything Madison had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. A chance to turn her painful experiences into something that could help others, to transform trauma into purpose. "I'd be honored to contribute to that program," Madison said, meaning every word. "Excellent. I'll have Marcus work with you on the initial proposals. We're looking at implementation beginning next quarter." Elena stood, extending her hand. "Welcome to the future of St. Catherine's veteran care, Ms. Taylor." As Madison shook the CEO's hand, she caught sight of movement in the outer office. Patricia Whitmore stood near the administrative assistants' desks, her face a mask of barely controlled fury as she watched the meeting conclude. The woman's body language radiated the kind of anger that came from watching carefully laid plans crumble. The elevator ride down felt different this time. Madison stood straighter, her reflection showing someone who belonged in this hospital, who had value beyond her appearance. But as the doors opened on the trauma unit floor, reality reasserted itself in the form of Patricia's voice echoing down the hallway. "I don't care what the CEO thinks. That woman is a liability, and I won't have the nursing department compromised by misplaced sentiment about military service." Madison paused outside the break room, where Patricia was holding court with several staff members. Through the partially open door, she could see the nurse director pacing with agitated energy. "Mrs. Rodriguez may be impressed by battlefield medicine," Patricia continued, "but this is a civilian hospital with civilian standards. We can't lower our requirements just to accommodate veterans who can't adapt to professional healthcare environments." Madison felt ice settle in her stomach as she recognized the careful phrasing, discrimination disguised as concern for standards. "Furthermore," Patricia added, "I've been reviewing staffing assignments and budget allocations. Some recent hiring decisions may need to be reconsidered. We have to prioritize staff who truly fit our institutional culture." The threat was clear. Whatever recognition Madison had received from Elena Rodriguez, Patricia was prepared to counter with administrative warfare. Over the following days, Patricia's retaliation began in earnest. Madison's schedule shifted without notice. Extra shifts, split schedules, weekend rotations that made planning impossible. Equipment requests were delayed or denied entirely. Required training sessions were scheduled during her break times, with makeup sessions unavailable. "Computer glitch," Patricia explained sweetly when Madison questioned the scheduling problems. "These systems are so complex. I'm sure we'll get it sorted out eventually." But the harassment went beyond mere inconvenience. Madison's patient assignments shifted to the most difficult cases: confused elderly patients, aggressive psychiatric holds, families angry about wait times or treatment outcomes. When she handled these challenges with professional grace, Patricia found new ways to question her performance. "Several families have mentioned feeling uncomfortable with your appearance," Patricia mentioned during a mandatory performance review that appeared on Madison's schedule without warning. "While I understand your situation, we have to consider patient satisfaction scores." "What specific complaints?" Madison asked, though she suspected none existed. Nothing formal, of course, just general feedback about professional presentation. Perhaps we could explore additional uniform options or cosmetic solutions. The suggestions came with documentation, performance improvement plans, professional development requirements, and mandatory counseling sessions that appeared in her employee file like a paper trail of incompetence. But Patricia's most effective weapon was isolation. Staff members who'd been friendly began keeping their distance, unwilling to risk their own positions by associating with someone clearly targeted by administration. Lunch invitations dried up. Casual conversations ended when Madison approached. Even Jake's veteran support network became cautious about being seen with her too frequently. "She's building a case," Maria warned during a brief encounter in the supply room. "Everything's being documented, every interaction scrutinized. She's trying to create a narrative of problems and conflicts." Madison felt the familiar weight of being marked, targeted, singled out for elimination. But this time was different. This time, she had allies who believed in her worth, supervisors who recognized her value, and a CEO who saw her potential. The question was whether recognition from above could overcome systematic harassment from below. As Madison finished her shift that Friday evening, she realized Patricia's campaign was just beginning, and the real test of her resolve lay ahead. The question was whether recognition from above could overcome systematic harassment from below. As Madison finished her shift that Friday evening, she realized Patricia's campaign was just beginning, and the real test of her resolve lay ahead. Madison was restocking trauma bay supplies when she heard the familiar voice calling her name. From the family waiting area, she turned to see Tommy bounding across the unit with the infectious energy that had carried him through pre-med studies and part-time jobs, his face lighting up when he spotted her. "Surprise!" he called out, earning concerned looks from families and staff who weren't used to such enthusiasm in the typically subdued trauma unit. "Thought I'd check out my big sister's new workplace." Madison felt her first genuine smile in days as Tommy wrapped her in a careful hug, mindful of her scarred arm, but refusing to treat her like she was fragile. At 22, he was still the optimistic kid who'd celebrated her army enlistment, visited her during every hospital stay, and never once looked at her scars with anything but pride. "What are you doing here? Don't you have organic chemistry or something equally horrible to study?" Study group got cancelled, and I was in the neighborhood. Tommy's grin faltered slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look tired, Maddie. Everything okay?" Madison glanced around the trauma unit, noting how conversations had quieted since Tommy's arrival. Patricia wasn't visible, but her presence hung over the department like a storm cloud, and Madison had learned to recognize the subtle signs of staff discomfort when family members appeared unexpectedly. "It's been a long week. Come on, let me show you around." As they toured the trauma bays, Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious. He peppered her with questions about equipment, procedures, and patient care protocols, his pre-med background making him genuinely interested in the clinical aspects of her work. Several staff members warmed to his obvious pride in his sister's expertise, and Madison found herself relaxing for the first time in days. "This is incredible," Tommy said as they passed the veteran care unit displays. "You're really making a difference here, aren't you?" "Trying to," Madison replied, though something in her tone made Tommy pause. Before he could ask follow-up questions, Patricia's voice cut through their conversation like a scalpel. "Miss Taylor, family visits are supposed to be coordinated through proper channels." Madison turned to find Patricia approaching with the predatory smile she'd learned to dread. The nurse director's attention fixed immediately on Tommy, cataloguing his casual student attire and youthful appearance with obvious disapproval. Mrs. Whitmore, this is my brother Tommy. Tommy, this is our nurse director Patricia Whitmore. Tommy extended his hand with the easy confidence of someone who'd never encountered systematic discrimination. Nice to meet you, ma'am. Madison's told me so much about St. Catherine's. This place is amazing. Patricia accepted his handshake with cool professionalism. I'm sure it is, though I hope Madison has also explained our policies about family visits during work hours. We maintain strict protocols to ensure patient care isn't compromised by personal distractions. The words were polite, but Madison caught the underlying message. Even her family was unwelcome in Patricia's domain. Of course, Tommy replied, though his smile became more cautious. I was just getting a quick tour. Madison's been so excited about working here. Yes, she's certainly enthusiastic about her role. Patricia's tone suggested this was not entirely positive. Though we've been working on helping her understand the particular standards and expectations that come with representing St. Catherine's. Madison felt her stomach clench as she recognized the setup. Patricia was performing for Tommy, demonstrating her authority while planting seeds of doubt about Madison's competence. I'm sure she's exceeding all your expectations, Tommy said, with the loyalty of someone who'd watched his sister save lives under enemy fire. Madison's the most dedicated medical professional I know. Patricia's smile sharpened. Military training is certainly valuable, though civilian healthcare requires different approaches, different sensitivities. Her gaze flickered meaningfully to Madison's scars. We've been working on professional presentation issues and helping her adapt to our patient populations. Expectations. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Tommy's expression shifted from confusion to growing alarm as he processed what he was hearing. Professional presentation, he repeated carefully. Nothing major, Patricia assured him with false warmth. Just helping Madison understand that our patients and families have certain comfort levels. We want everyone to feel at ease during what are already stressful situations. Tommy's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, understanding, and finally, anger. Madison watched her brother realize that someone was criticizing her appearance, suggesting her scars made others uncomfortable, treating her service-related injuries as professional liabilities. Are you talking about her scars? Tommy asked, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that Madison recognized from their childhood arguments. Patricia's mask slipped slightly. I'm talking about comprehensive professional development, which includes her scars from pulling 3 soldiers out of a burning vehicle. Tommy's voice was rising now, drawing attention from across the trauma unit. The scars she got saving lives while people like you were safe at home? Young man, I understand. You're protective of your sister, but protective? Tommy stepped closer to Patricia, his pre-med student politeness evaporating. Lady, those scars represent everything that's right about my sister. If your patients are uncomfortable looking at a hero's battle wounds, that's their problem, not hers. The trauma unit had gone completely silent. Staff members pretended to work while obviously listening to every word. Madison felt mortification and pride warring in her chest as her little brother defended her with the fierce loyalty that had sustained them both through years of struggle. Patricia's composure cracked further. This is exactly the kind of disruption I was referring to. Military families often struggle to understand civilian professional standards. Civilian professional standards? Tommy's voice carried across the entire unit now. Is that what you call discriminating against veterans? Because where I come from, we call that unpatriotic and disgraceful. Madison stepped between them, recognizing the moment when Patricia's careful harassment was becoming public humiliation for Patricia. Tommy, she said quietly, it's okay. No, it's not okay. Tommy's attention shifted to her, his anger softening into concern. Maddie, This woman is harassing you because of your scars. That's not professional development. That's discrimination." Around them, staff members were no longer pretending to work. Dr. Stevens stood frozen at the nurse's station, his expression shifting from embarrassment to growing outrage as he processed what he was witnessing. Other nurses exchanged meaningful glances, pieces of a larger pattern finally clicking into place. Patricia seemed to realize she'd overplayed her hand. Her careful campaign of subtle harassment had been exposed by the shocked reaction of someone who'd never encountered such behavior before. "I think," Patricia said, struggling to regain control, "this conversation should continue in private." "No," Tommy said firmly. "This conversation should continue very publicly, because what you're doing to my sister is wrong, and everyone here should know about it." Madison looked around the trauma unit at the faces of her colleagues, some shocked, some supportive, some uncomfortable with the confrontation but unable to deny what they'd witnessed. For the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's, Patricia's behavior had been exposed in all its ugly specificity. The battle for Madison's place at the hospital had just shifted from guerrilla warfare to open conflict, and Tommy had just fired the first shot in a war that Patricia might not be prepared to fight. The battle for Madison's place at the hospital had just shifted from guerrilla warfare to open conflict, and Tommy had just fired the first shot in a war that Patricia might not be prepared to fight. The weekend that followed Tommy's confrontation passed with unusual quiet, as if the entire trauma unit was holding its breath. Madison worked her shifts with hypervigilant awareness, noting every whispered conversation, every meaningful glance between staff members. Every moment Patricia appeared at the edges of her vision like a predator circling wounded prey. Monday morning brought an unexpected announcement over the hospital's PA system. "Captain James Williams, please report to the main information desk." Madison felt her stomach drop. Doc Williams wasn't supposed to visit for another month, and unscheduled. Visits from former commanding officers usually meant problems. She found him in the lobby 20 minutes later, his dress uniform impeccable despite the early hour. Captain Williams looked exactly as she remembered. Steel-grey hair, weathered face, and the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten their posture. His expression was carefully neutral, but Madison had served under him long enough to recognize the subtle signs of controlled anger. "Taylor," he said simply, extending his hand. "You look good. Hospital treating you well?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. "Learning the ropes, sir. Civilian healthcare has its own complexities." "I imagine it does." His eyes swept the impressive lobby, taking in the marble floors and soaring ceilings. "Hell of a place. Mind giving me the tour?" As they walked through the hospital, Madison found herself seeing St. Catherine's through Doc Williams' eyes. The captain had spent 30 years in military medicine, from field hospitals in Iraq to the prestigious Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He understood healthcare hierarchies, institutional politics, and the subtle ways discrimination could flourish in bureaucratic environments. "So," he said, as they passed the veteran care displays, "how's the integration going? Any challenges with the transition to civilian protocols?" Madison chose her words carefully. "There's been some adjustment period. Different expectations, different communication styles." Doc Williams stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Taylor, I've known you for 6 years. You don't speak in bureaucratic bullshit unless someone's taught you to be afraid of. Plain English, what's really going on?" Before Madison could answer, Patricia's voice interrupted them from behind. "Excuse me, but visitors need to check in at the main desk and receive proper identification badges." They turned to find Patricia approaching with 2 security guards, her expression radiating authority and barely concealed irritation. Madison felt ice form in her stomach as she realized Patricia was treating a decorated military officer like a potential security threat. "Ma'am," Doc Williams replied with military courtesy, "I'm Captain James Williams, United States Army Medical Corps. I'm here to conduct a follow-up evaluation of one of my former soldiers." He produced his military identification with practiced efficiency, but Patricia barely glanced at it. "I'm sure that's very nice, Captain, but this is a civilian hospital with civilian security protocols. All visitors must be properly processed and escorted at all times." Madison watched Doc Williams' expression carefully. His face remained neutral, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. In 30 years of military service, he'd earned respect from generals and battlefield surgeons alike. Being treated like a security risk by a hospital administrator was not sitting well. "Of course," he said evenly, "I wouldn't want to violate any protocols." As they proceeded with the proper check-in process, Madison caught Patricia's satisfied smile. The nurse director was demonstrating her authority, showing both Madison and her former commanding officer who controlled this environment. The tour continued under Patricia's watchful supervision, but Doc Williams was no longer just observing the facilities. He was conducting reconnaissance, studying staff interactions, noting the subtle dynamics that revealed institutional culture. Madison watched him catalogue every detail with the methodical precision that had made him legendary in military medical circles. They were examining the trauma bay equipment when the confrontation escalated. "Captain Williams," Patricia said with false sweetness, "I hope you understand that Ms. Taylor is still in her probationary period. We're working very hard to help her adapt to our standards here at St. Catherine's." "What kind of standards?" Doc Williams asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Professional presentation standards primarily. Civilian patients have different expectations than military personnel. We've been helping her understand the importance of appropriate appearance in healthcare settings." Madison felt her face burn with humiliation as Patricia essentially told her former commanding officer that her scars made patients uncomfortable. But Doc Williams's reaction was not what Patricia expected. "Appropriate appearance," he repeated, slowly. "Are you referring to the scars Ms. Taylor received while saving 3 soldiers' lives under enemy fire?" Patricia's smile faltered slightly. "I'm referring to comprehensive professional development." "Because those scars," Doc Williams continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "represent the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and commendations for heroism under fire. They represent the fact that 3 mothers got their sons back alive because this woman chose their lives over her own safety." The trauma unit had gone quiet again, staff members pausing their work to listen. Madison recognized several faces from her support network: Jake, Maria, Dr. Stevens, watching the confrontation with growing interest. "I'm sure her military service is commendable," Patricia replied, her composure cracking. "But this is a hospital, not a military base. We have different priorities here." "Different priorities," Doc Williams said, and Madison heard 30 years of controlled anger in those 2 words. "Tell me, Ms. Whitmore, what are your qualifications in trauma medicine?" "I don't see how." "But that's relevant, because Ms. Taylor has more trauma experience than half your medical staff combined. She's treated casualties in conditions that would send most civilian nurses into shock. She's made life-or-death decisions while mortars were falling around her." His voice grew quieter, but more dangerous. "So, when you question her professional standards, you're questioning the judgment of someone who's proven her competence under fire." Patricia's face had gone pale, but she pressed on. "Military training is valuable, but civilian healthcare requires exactly what Ms. Taylor provides," Doc Williams interrupted. "Clinical excellence, situational awareness, and the ability to function under extreme pressure." The only thing it doesn't require is discrimination against veterans. The word hung in the air like an explosive device. Discrimination, said aloud in public by a respected military officer who'd witnessed Patricia's behavior firsthand. "Captain Williams," Patricia said, her voice tight with fury, "I resent the implication." "I'm not implying anything," Doc Williams replied. "I'm stating facts. You're harassing a decorated combat veteran because her service-related injuries don't meet your aesthetic standards. Where I come from, we have a word for that." Around them, the trauma unit had become a theater of uncomfortable silence. Madison watched her colleagues process what they were hearing, an external authority figure calling out behavior they'd witnessed but been too intimidated to challenge. Dr. Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the crowd, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as he grasped the situation. Behind him, Madison caught sight of other administrators drawn by reports of a situation in the trauma unit. The confrontation had reached a tipping point. Patricia's careful campaign of subtle harassment had been dragged into the light by someone who couldn't be intimidated, dismissed, or transferred to another department, and everyone was watching to see what would happen next. The confrontation had reached a tipping point. Patricia's careful campaign of subtle harassment had been dragged into the light by someone who couldn't be intimidated, dismissed, or transferred to another department. And everyone was watching to see what would happen next. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes reflecting growing alarm. "Captain Williams, Miss Whitmore, perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more private setting." "I think privacy is part of the problem," Doc Williams replied, his voice carrying across the still, silent trauma unit. "This conversation needs witnesses." Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "I will not be lectured about hospital policy by someone who doesn't understand civilian healthcare standards. I understand discrimination when I see it," Doc Williams cut her off, "and I understand retaliation against veterans who've sacrificed for their country." "Captain Williams," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly, "I think we need to involve my mother in this conversation." Within 30 minutes, they were assembled in Elena Rodriguez's office, a group that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Doc Williams sat across from Elena's desk in his dress uniform, every ribbon and medal a testament to 3 decades of distinguished service. Dr. Rodriguez flanked his mother's right side, his expression grave. Patricia occupied a chair to the left, her earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled anger. Madison sat slightly apart from the others, feeling like evidence in a trial she hadn't asked to attend. "Captain Williams," Eleanor began. "Doctor, Rodriguez tells me you have concerns about Miss Taylor's treatment here at St. Catherine's." "Ma'am, with respect, I have concerns about systematic discrimination against a decorated combat veteran," Doc Williams replied. "What I witnessed today was not professional development. It was harassment." Elena's expression remained neutral, but Madison caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Those are serious allegations. Can you be more specific?" Doc Williams pulled out a small notebook, the same kind Madison remembered him carrying in Afghanistan. "In the past hour, I've witnessed Ms. Whitmore question Ms. Taylor's professional appearance due to scars received in combat. I've heard her suggest that patients are uncomfortable with a veteran's service-related injuries. I've watched her treat a Purple Heart recipient like a liability rather than an asset." "Those incidents were taken out of context," Patricia interjected. "I was discussing comprehensive professional development, not targeting anyone's military service." "Ms. Whitmore," Eleanor said carefully, "perhaps you could explain your perspective on Ms. Taylor's performance." Patricia straightened, apparently, believing she was back on familiar ground. "Ms. Taylor has struggled to adapt to our institutional culture. There have been multiple incidents of protocol violations, inappropriate independent decision-making, and concerning interactions with patients and families. What specific incidents? Dr. Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Unauthorized diagnostic input during emergencies, failure to follow proper chains of command, and ongoing issues with professional presentation that have generated patient complaints. Madison felt her stomach clench. The accusation sounded damning when stripped of context, reduced to bureaucratic talking points. What patient complaints? Elena asked. Patricia hesitated for the first time. General feedback about comfort levels and professional expectations. Documented complaints, names, specific incidents. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Patricia said, "Not all feedback is formally documented. Sometimes patients express concerns informally." Doc Williams leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, with respect, that sounds like manufactured justification for predetermined conclusions." "Captain Williams," Elena said, "you mentioned witnessing discrimination. Can you provide specifics?" "Yes, ma'am." Doc Williams consulted his notebook. At approximately 0930 hours, Ms. Whitmore told Ms. Taylor that her scars made patients uncomfortable and suggested cosmetic solutions to hide her service-related injuries. At 0945, she implied that military families struggle to understand civilian professional standards. At 1000 hours, she stated that Ms. Taylor's military training was inappropriate for civilian health care. Eleanor's expression had grown progressively colder with each item. "Ms. Whitmore, did you make these statements?" "I was discussing professional development in the context of, did you suggest that Ms. Taylor's scars make patients uncomfortable?" Patricia's face flushed. "I was addressing comprehensive patient satisfaction considerations." "That's a yes," Eleanor said quietly. "Did you imply that her military training was inadequate for civilian health care?" "I was explaining the differences between military and civilian protocols." "Dr. Rodriguez?" Elena continued without acknowledging Patricia's response. "What has been Ms. Taylor's actual performance in the trauma unit?" Marcus straightened in his chair. "Exceptional. She's diagnosed critical conditions other staff missed, demonstrated advanced trauma skills, and consistently provided excellent patient care. Her military experience has been invaluable." "Any documented performance issues?" "None. In fact, I've recommended her for expanded responsibilities in our veteran care program." Elena turned back to Patricia. "Ms. Whitmore, you mentioned protocol violations. Can you provide specifics?" "She's exceeded her authorized scope of practice, made independent medical decisions, and failed to follow proper supervisory chains." You mean," Dr. Rodriguez interjected, "she helped save a patient's life by identifying a pneumothorax during a trauma emergency." "She's not authorized to make diagnostic decisions. She's authorized to use her clinical judgment and communicate observations to physicians," Elena said firmly, "which is exactly what she did." Doc Williams cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if I may, I'd like to know if other veterans have experienced similar treatment." Elena's eyes sharpened. "Dr. Rodriguez? I've heard rumors, staff members uncomfortable, reporting incidents, but Jake Morrison in PT has mentioned ongoing issues with scheduling and resource allocation." "I want a full review," Elena said, her voice carrying executive authority. "Every veteran employee, every personnel action, every performance evaluation from the past 2 years." Patricia's face had gone white. "Elena, surely you don't believe these unfounded accusations?" "I believe what I've heard with my own ears," Elena replied coldly. "I believe a decorated military officer's first-hand testimony, and I believe in the mission of this hospital to serve all patients with dignity and respect, provided by staff who are treated with the same dignity and respect." She stood, moving to the window overlooking the medical campus. St. Catherine's, exists because my late husband believed that service, military or civilian, deserved honor, not harassment. Our veteran care program was founded on the principle that those who've sacrificed for others deserve our support, not our discrimination. Eleanor turned back to face the group. Ms. Whitmore, your employment at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your access cards and keys will be collected, and your personal items will be forwarded. The words fell like hammer blows. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, soundlessly before she found her voice. You can't. I have connections, board members who'll... Ms. Whitmore, Eleanor said with glacial calm. The board members you're referring to trust my judgment implicitly. They also include several veterans who would be very interested in your treatment of military personnel. Patricia stood shakily, her professional mask finally crumbling completely. This is a mistake. You're choosing political correctness over institutional standards. I'm choosing human decency over institutional bigotry, Elena replied. Security is waiting outside. As Patricia was escorted from the office, Elena turned to Madison with an expression of profound regret. Ms. Taylor, I owe you an apology. This hospital failed you, and I failed you by not recognizing what was happening. Madison felt tears threaten for the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Elena said. Thank me when we've built a culture where this never happens again. Justice had been served, but the real work of healing was just beginning. Justice had been served, but the real work of healing was just beginning. 6 months later, Madison stood before the packed auditorium in St. Catherine's Education Center, looking out at an audience that would have seemed impossible during those first difficult weeks. The front rows held hospital executives, department heads, and board members. Behind them sat nurses, physicians, therapists, and support staff from every corner of the medical center. In the back, she spotted familiar faces. Jake Morrison with his infectious grin, Maria Santos beaming with pride, Dr. Stevens nodding encouragement. Most importantly, Tommy sat in the third row alongside Doc Williams, both wearing expressions of fierce pride that made Madison's throat tighten with emotion. 6 months ago, Madison began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, I walked into this hospital carrying invisible wounds alongside my visible scars. I thought the scars were my greatest liability, reminders of trauma that made others uncomfortable, barriers to acceptance in civilian healthcare. She paused, looking down at her left arm, where the burn scars caught the auditorium lights. Today, she wore short sleeves by choice, no longer hiding the evidence of her service. I was wrong about many things, but mostly I was wrong about what healing means. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Madison had discovered she was a natural speaker, able to translate complex experiences into accessible truths that resonated with healthcare workers struggling with their own challenges. Healing isn't about erasing scars, it's about transforming them from sources of shame into symbols of strength. It's about creating environments where differences are valued, where experience is honored, where every person's contribution matters. The veteran care program had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had started as Madison's personal integration challenge had evolved into a comprehensive initiative that was drawing national attention. The specialized trauma protocols she'd helped develop were being adopted by hospitals across the country. The peer support network Jake had informally created was now an official program with dedicated funding and administrative support. When we launched the Enhanced Veteran Care Initiative, Madison continued, we started with a simple premise. Those who've served in combat bring unique perspectives to healthcare that can benefit all patients, not just veterans. The results spoke for themselves. Patient satisfaction scores had improved dramatically. Staff retention in high-stress departments had increased. The hospital's reputation for trauma care had attracted new partnerships and federal funding. What Patricia had seen as a threat to institutional image had become St. Catherine's greatest competitive advantage. Today, we're announcing the next phase of our program, Madison said, feeling excitement build in her chest. The National Center for Veteran Healthcare Excellence, headquartered right here at St. Catherine's, will train healthcare workers from across the country in trauma-informed care, peer support methodologies, and inclusive workplace practices. The applause was thunderous. Elena Rodriguez stood at the side of the stage, her face radiating the satisfaction of seeing her vision not just realized but exceeded. Dr. Rodriguez sat with the other department heads, his expression reflecting pride in the program he'd helped nurture from conception. But the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics or recognition. It was in the faces of individual staff members who'd found their voices, patients who'd received exceptional care, and veterans who'd discovered that their service had value beyond the battlefield. Change doesn't happen overnight, Madison continued as the applause subsided. It happens through countless small acts of courage, speaking up when you witness discrimination, offering support when someone needs an ally, choosing inclusion over exclusion even when it's uncomfortable. She thought about the difficult conversations, the policy revisions, the cultural shifts that had transformed St. Catherine's from a place where appearance mattered more than ability to an institution that truly lived its values. The process hadn't been smooth. There had been resistance, setbacks, and moments when the easier path would have been to accept the status quo. The most important lesson I've learned is that healing is a community effort. No one recovers from trauma alone, and no institution changes without collective commitment to doing better. Madison spotted Dr. Stevens in the audience, remembering how he'd struggled with guilt over not intervening during Patricia's harassment. He'd become one of the program's strongest advocates, using his influence to mentor younger staff in recognizing and addressing discrimination. To the veterans in this audience, your service matters, your experience has value, and your scars, visible or invisible, are proof of survival, not symbols of damage. To everyone else, we all carry wounds of one kind or another. The question isn't whether we're damaged, but whether we'll use our experiences to help others heal. The standing ovation that followed felt different from the polite applause that had greeted her earlier presentations. This was recognition not just of achievement but of transformation, personal and institutional. As Madison left the podium, she was surrounded by colleagues who'd become friends, veterans who'd found purpose, and administrators who'd discovered that doing the right thing was also good business. Tommy pushed through the crowd to wrap her in a fierce hug, while Doc Williams waited with the patient smile of someone whose faith in the system had been restored. "You did it," Tommy whispered in her ear. "You changed everything." Madison looked around the auditorium at the faces reflecting hope, determination, and possibility. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us." Later, as the crowd dispersed and the excitement settled into satisfaction, Madison found herself in the trauma bay where it had all begun. The night shift was beginning, nurses checking equipment with the same methodical precision she'd brought to that first day. But something fundamental had changed. The atmosphere felt inclusive rather than exclusive, supportive rather than judgmental. A young nurse approached hesitantly, her scrubs bearing the fresh creases of someone new to the profession. "Ms. Taylor, I'm Sarah Chen, starting my first day tomorrow. I just wanted to say thank you for making this place somewhere I want to work." Madison smiled, remembering her own first day and the fear that had nearly overwhelmed her potential. "Welcome to St. Catherine's, Sarah. You're going to do great things here." As Sarah walked away with renewed confidence, Madison touched her scars gently, no longer hiding them, no longer ashamed of them, finally understanding that they were part of a story worth telling. The healing was complete, but the mission was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.